Hi everyone, Dr. Hinkey here with our lecture presentation on Chapter 15 on evolution. So we'll look through, the chapter starts with sort of a rundown of the history of evolution, of evolutionary thought, what all went into it, as we learned right from the start in Chapter 1 with the scientific method. The word theory in science has a specific meaning, which is quite different from hypothesis. A hypothesis is what we propose prior to gathering evidence through experimentation. A hypothesis is what we test, what we're not sure of. It's an opinion, should be an informed opinion, but it's not backed by evidence. We test that. We try to disprove it. The more times and more ways we try to disprove it and can't, the more support we have for it. Those are our conclusions. Each time we test a hypothesis, we can draw a conclusion. A theory is taking all of the conclusions from testing many related hypotheses, so amassing a lot of evidence through rigorous testing, and then we're able to develop a predictive model of what will happen in the real world based on our now comprehensive understanding and evidence-based understanding of what's going on, and then we develop that model is called a theory. So Darwin's theory of evolution, I always say Darwin's, it was Darwin and Wallace, was developed not just by Charles Darwin, not just through one hypothesis tested, but through years and years of many hypotheses being tested, continues to be tested, and the more times we cannot demonstrate that it is not accurate, that our hypotheses are not wrong, it's more evidence supporting this theory. So we, as we learned in science, continue to test. We never shut down further inquiry. We never say it's been proven, because the more times we cannot disprove it, the stronger our evidence is, and the more ways we look at it, the more we can refine it and have a better and better picture, a more complete final picture to that puzzle, as we saw in that puzzle analogy to the scientific method. So this history of evolutionary thought really shows all of the rigorous analysis that went into development of this theory, and then we continue on as we look at the evidence. We look at continuing new and emerging evidence as we get new technologies and new ways to look at these processes of how populations evolve. So when you look at Darwin's theory of evolution, sort of the basis underlying what he and Wallace proposed, some of the basic premises that other researchers contributed to the development of the theory is that the Earth is really, really old, that we have descent from generation to generation from a common ancestor, but with changes over time. And what drives those changes over time is that we're adapting, organisms, populations adapt to a changing environment. So the evidence that we will look at includes fossil evidence, biogeographical evidence, anatomical evidence, and biochemical and developmental evidence. So here's Charles Darwin. This is 31, so this is 9 years after he departed on his voyage on the Beagle, which for the 2-year cruise turned into a 5-year cruise, allowed him to amass a lot of evidence, a lot of samples that he went on and analyzed and looked at and studied for another 2 decades before publishing the theory of evolution, because he had to really make sure there was substantial rigor behind it. Darwin's an interesting character, just background, just some interesting stuff. He came from a family of medical doctors. He went to medical school. He was very squeamish about blood, couldn't stand the sight of blood, so not so much for the medical school for him. As a child, he was very shy, very introverted, didn't have a whole lot of friends. And so his mother, to kind of help him developmentally help him socially, would take him out on long walks, and they would collect things. And he was a meticulous collector. He had rock collections, leaf collections, insect collections that he would meticulously catalog and organize. And then he continued that as a hobby through college, when medical school turned out to not be up his alley. He went to the seminary. He went into the seminary, and a lot of scientists at this time went into the seminary because it gave them a way to continue studying, pursuing their interest in studying the natural world, while also having a career that gave them flexibility and free time to do that. So that was where he went to college at Christ Church, and but he continued to collect, to be an avid collector, and he befriended some science professors, some natural science professors, who then recommended him. One in particular recommended him for a trip on the Beagle, based on the letters, based on correspondence between him and his family, his brother and his father, and this professor who was his mentor. It suggested that he perhaps had autism. He was socially awkward, did not like to be in large crowds, didn't like to be around people. His very meticulous attention to detail and ability to focus and organize, take all sorts of external stimuli and kind of narrow down and beeline and focus onto specifics and details. We're all suggestive of that. And so now it's thought that he's probably on the autism scale, on the autism spectrum. And that's actually what contributed to his ability to take all of this data that he gathered over 5 years, all of these observations, and this trip that covered the entire world, especially the southern hemisphere, and to organize that and see the patterns and all of that information. So if we look sort of at the history of this prior to Darwin, what was going on before Darwin? In the hundreds of years prior to that, just basically this view that nature was determined based on how the Bible described it. So very deep-seated beliefs that were held to be intractable truths. That, this is the earth, this is the way it was created, and that's it. That's how it's always been and how it always will be. But then based on his observations around the world, and not just Darwin's, but all sorts of biologists and geologists, based on observations, based on these research journeys, these trips, started to propose in the early 1800s these different ideas about evolution. They're seeing that that there are these similarities between living things, and that probably reflects some sort of common ancestry. And the more similar, the more recent that common ancestry is, and the more different probably suggests, some more ancient common ancestry. So that was sort of where we went from where we started at, this is how the earth has always been, to maybe these things are changing over time. So some of the people that helped contribute to Darwin's theory, who had other hypotheses that they tested, who looked at other questions that were related to this broader theory. Carl Linnaeus, who's considered the father of taxonomy, he's the one who initially said, hey, I'm going to catalog every living thing. And at the time, he estimated, his hypothesis was there are probably 1,500 species of living things in the world. So he was from one of those northern latitude European countries where there's not a lot of biodiversity. And he actually never really traveled anywhere to gather samples other than in his, maybe Norway. And he sent graduate students, he sent his students out into the world to collect samples, and as they came back, he kept, of course, increasing his estimate of how many, as he found, like, wow, maybe there are a whole lot more. But despite having all of these students who are on these research journeys, traveling, coming back with samples, all sorts of samples, he really believed in this fixity of species, that each species has this ideal structure and function for it in this place on the scala naturae, the scale of this natural scale of complexity that went, from, didn't know about bacteria at the time, but from, the smallest, most insignificant worm up through humans, and then angels were one step ahead. And that's just, everything was in that structure on that scale and never moved. But he did develop the way to classify organisms based on phenotype, based on appearance and anatomical similarities. And we still use that classification system today. Count Buffon, Georges Louis Leclerc, was another one who also attempted to catalog all living species, and based on his observations as he began cataloging them, suggested, well, maybe the reason we see all these differences and yet similarities is because we have descent over time, with modification over time. So you're seeing these changes in similar species, in the same species over time. Through his evidence. He used comparative anatomy to look at those changes over time. He is also the first person who came up with this idea of a definition of species as organisms that are able to mate together and produce viable offspring. So he saw that we could have two similar organisms mate and have offspring, but that these would be infertile. And so that should be our classification. If they can mate and produce viable offspring, then they're in the same species. And which is one, we'll talk about that in the chapters ahead, one definition of species. Some other contributions. Georges Cuvier, he's considered the founder of paleontology. He also used comparative anatomy to develop a system of classification. So there are a lot of competing systems of classification. They sort of all ended up, since they were doing similar things, did end up going in similar directions, but the Linnaean system is the one that we still use. That's the domain. Domain is new. Linnaeus didn't have that, but kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That structure is what Linnaeus came up with that we still use. Georges Cuvier is the founder of paleontology, and he looked at the strata, at the layers as he would dig for fossils. He saw these strata through the layers as he went down, and every now and then he would see where all of a sudden we had this change, not only in the soil type and the sediments and the layers, but also this whole new change, a whole new mix of fossils periodically. And what he proposed was that local catastrophes in the past caused this drastic change. So we'd have layer, 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 everything in here, all the fossils are the same, and then boom, like maybe a layer of ash or something that would suggest a giant forest fire or volcanic eruption. And then we have all these layers with a whole different mix of fossils. And so he proposed that these local catastrophes, periodic catastrophes, caused this change, this new mix of species to live in the area that contributed to new different fossils. So after each catastrophe, the region was repopulated by species from the surrounding area. He went back and forth. Sometimes he said that would happen, that it was that organisms from the surrounding area came in, and so they were different, and we had different species. And then every now and then he'd take that back and say, well, nope, after one of these natural catastrophes that was wrought by God, God said, here's some new species to put in this area. So we kind of went back and forth on that. Another contributor to Darwin's theory, a lot of people don't know about this, is Erasmus Darwin. This is Charles's grandfather. He also used comparative anatomy and looked at vestigial structures and said, hey, we can see this progression where it was here, and now we just have these remnants that we aren't using or aren't have been modified or reduced because they no longer serve a purpose. He also looked at changes in physiology during development. And he looked at these outcomes of artificial selection. So, humans had been breeding organisms in animal husbandry for thousands of years, in agriculture for thousands of years. And we were able to artificially select certain traits and over time change species. So he proposed that evolution happens. If humans can induce evolution, then maybe it just happens anyway. But that sort of fell flat, didn't go anywhere, because he couldn't propose a mechanism for how that would happen. Why, other than with human intervention for agriculture, animal husbandry, why would this happen? So he didn't propose any mechanism. So it really didn't go any further at that point. Some other contributors: Lamarck. Lamarck was the first biologist to actually propose a testable hypothesis with a mechanism explaining how evolution might happen. He did link diversity, all the different types of organisms, with adaptation to the environment. And he also proposed, looking at this diversity, that more complex organisms are descended from less complex organisms. And based on this observation of that there are more and less complex organisms, and that organisms seem to be best suited for their environment, he proposed the hypothesis of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And so what inheritance of acquired characteristics says is that if an organism is using or doing something that changes it physically during its lifetime, it will pass that change on to its offspring. So, for example, I don't think you can tell in these videos, I have purple hair. According to Lamarck, because I acquired purple hair in my lifetime, my offspring would have purple hair. So we have since discovered that Lamarck was off base. Lamarckian inheritance does not exist. Acquired characteristics cannot be passed down. So a physical change, what his example was that, giraffes would stretch their necks out to reach the higher leaves. And by stretching their necks out, it elongated their neck. And by elongating their neck, that gets passed down. Their offspring will automatically have longer necks. Now how it works, we have to have a genetic basis to pass down a characteristic. And so that one was disproven. But he did give a proposed mechanism for how it might happen. So others who came up with some hypotheses and some testable or verifiable observations: Charles Lyell and James Hutton. These again were paleontologists, and looking at those strata, those layers in the earth, they realized to have so many layers in the earth, to see that rate of sedimentation, they propose that the earth is subject to these continuous, ongoing, but very, very slow cycles of erosion and then sedimentation and then uplift. And they just go on very, very gradually, geological time scales. And so looking at the strata, looking at the fossils, looking at the rates of sedimentation currently, and what they also said was that, what we're seeing now with these natural phenomena, this has been going on for the entire life history of the Earth. And so they concluded that the Earth has to be much, 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 much older than just a few thousand years. which the time it was thought, oh, the Earth is about 3,000 or 4,000 years old. And so there's no way we can see what we're seeing in the mountains and the strata and the different layers for that to be true. So Lyell also proposed, based on those observations, uniformitarianism, which is the opposite of catastrophism, where we have layers, everything's the same, and then boom, catastrophe, everything's different. What Lyell proposed was that we just saw these changes gradually in the fossil record, which as you go up through the fossil record, we have this organism, then slowly that skeleton becomes, or that fossil now looks like this, and we see this gradual change, this gradual progression of very similar organisms with just small changes that accumulate over long periods of time, as opposed to this sudden, complete revision. Both uniformitarianism and catastrophism now have lots of evidence supporting that, yes, uniformitarianism is going on sort of in this background level, but periodically and in certain places and local conditions do have catastrophism making this change as well. So there's evidence that yes, they are both correct and both happen. Catastrophism happens with one major shift in a local area, but inside of this background uniformitarianism. Thomas Malthus is an interesting contribution, because Malthus was not a biologist, he wasn't a scientist, he wasn't studying natural history of the earth. He was an economist, and he studied factors that influence the growth and decline of human populations, which, yes, he was an economist, but since he was studying human populations, we now know that is biology. And it's interesting because Malthus, he didn't consider himself a biologist, and what he was studying was what are the factors that are going to influence human society. And now we see these as very much accepted biological principles that we learned about at the beginning of the semester in chapters 44 and 45. The size of human populations is limited by the quantity of resources, food, water, shelter, space. We now call that carrying capacity. And what he did, he related famine, war, epidemics, all of these things to populations that had overstretched their limited resources. So famine, we've used up all the resources, all the food resources, or drought, we've used up all the water resources. War, because we're running out of space and we're moving into other people's territories. So that's from overpopulation, from humans exceeding their carrying capacity. Darwin read Malthus's paper on this and applied those same principles to animal populations in his thinking based on his observations. So Alfred Wallace, this is Darwin's partner who never gets any credit, helped him to develop, based on all his evidence and observations, based on the meticulous records that he kept in going through these, and it took him another 20 years to organize it all, but Wallace was a main contributor, so it's really Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution. Wallace studied biogeography, and that is the study of the distribution of species and ecosystems in geographic space and through geological time. And he saw that communities vary in a regular fashion along geographic gradients of latitude, elevation, isolation, and habitat area. And we see that as you climb to higher elevations, we can see the vegetation and the organisms that live there change. From habitat to habitat, we see changes in latitude associated with changes in what species live in an area, and then even within a specific latitude. For example, at our latitude, the swamp has a very different group of organisms living in it than if you go into the Midlands or if you look across prairies versus coastal areas, so different habitats. And his biogeographical observations contributed or were repeated by what Darwin saw. And what he saw in his travels were similar species living in similar habitats, different places. So different places around the globe. If the habitat was similar, the species that lived there tended to be similar. And so he reasoned that related species could be modified according to the environment in which they lived. So some of his observations with regard to this are on his adventure on the Beagle was that fossils and strata and uplifted cliffs. So when they sailed past big cliffs where you could actually see the strata, all those strata from that uplifted area, the Earth has to be very old. So Lyell and Hutton, that's verified what they had proposed. He saw descent with modification and seeing different species over time in the fossil record that were similar but slightly different. And so that existing species, something that this had not been thought possible, species on Earth, or all those on Earth, and then found, oh, some are extinct, some we no longer have. And he thought existing species might be descended from extinct species. And some of those observations were finding the skeletons for things like this, which is, looks a lot like an armadillo, only giant. The giant sloth, you want to see a 13-foot tall sloth, as opposed to the little sloths we have now. But that, so these existing smaller species could be descendants from these. He also observed that similar environments on different continents had similar looking animals. And that similar species replaced one another as habitat changed. So as he traveled further from the equator, he saw changes. With changing habitat, got changing organisms. And so again, this supported that species could be modified according to environmental differences. The Galápagos, so they spent quite a bit of time there, and a lot of these observations were quite remarkable at the time, and really contributed and demonstrated in a very small place, sort of gave an idea of the mechanisms that were going on to lead to differences in variation. So the finches, these he almost discounted because, they're these little birds, whatever, not paying attention to them. But he actually collected samples, and he observed they were different. He wasn't sure what they were, and then he had a fellow scientist who was a birder who looked at them and said, oh, look at that. Yeah, they're all different species of finches. They just looked quite different from the finches he was used to in Europe. But they were finches. He observed lots of different finches on the different islands, and their main difference was their beak size. And so he speculated they could have descended from a single pair of mainland finch, and then just based on the environment or the niche that they filled. So if you feed on the ground and you're feeding on seeds, you need this big, thick beak to break the seeds. If you go after insects that live in the tree, you need kind of this sharp, long, or pointy beak. Or if you are eating on a variety of leaves somewhere else on the tree or flowers or something, you need different shaped beaks based on what your food source, your niche. And so he proposed maybe they all came from, because what are the odds that we're going to have 23 different species of finch all land on this little island, that they descended with modification based on the niche they filled from a single ancestor. Interestingly, scientists in the Galapagos now are seeing a new species of finch evolve with a slightly different beak shape from any of the existing finches, and their food source that they are taking advantage of. Their new niche is actually from tourists feeding them French fries and people, human food, breadcrumbs and human food. But their behaviors have isolated them and led to reproductive isolation. So because they all live in the same area and come out and see each other because they're not afraid to be around the people. And so they're seeing sort of this isolation and this reproductive isolation of this group of finches and changes in beak and behavior structure, which is what we're going to learn about in chapter 16 and 17. It's just very interesting that we can see this continuing on now, that it's not like, oh yeah, they evolved into these 23 species and we're done. This is an ongoing process. The tortoises were the other organism that he's quite famous for this. Barnacles are another one that we'll talk about later of his observations. But he observed tortoises and from island to island, their neck length varied. And what was different about the islands was the vegetation, where you had drier islands with cactus, where the tortoises would have to get up high on the cactus to get to the flowers and get around the thorns, or they were eating shrubs on the ground. And they had different neck length based on what their food source was. So he proposed that speciation on the islands with regard to the tortoises correlated with different vegetation on those different islands. So these are all the different observations he's amassing and the proposed ideas he's putting out, the hypotheses he has regarding these. And so after he had just amassed all this evidence, those are just kind of a few highlights that everybody hears about. He took all this evidence and analyzed, spent 20 years analyzing all this data that he had, looking at what others before him had proposed, what they had studied, what they had found. And what he proposed with regard to evolution and natural selection is that individuals have heritable variations. Right? So we have variation within any population, and these are driven by our genetics so that they can be passed down to our offspring. So we have to have heritable variation. Our phenotypic differences are due to our genotypic differences. And within any population, there are more individuals produced each generation than the environment can support. And that results in a competition for resources. So maybe initially with a very small population, remember our population growth curve, we start with very small growth, we can support it, but at some point reproduction is going to outpace the resources in the environment. We will approach carrying capacity. So we will have competition because within a species, right, intraspecies, when I'm competing with somebody who else is in the same species, I have the exact same needs. That's going to be closer competition. Because of that variation in the population, individuals will differ in their reproductive success. So they're going to differ in their reproductive success because those that are better able to compete for the resources, those that can get the food, get the space, and grow and reach reproductive maturity and find a mate and best compete for a mate, are also going to be those that have the energy left over to reproduce, and they will be successful in passing on the genes that carry on the variation that made them better able to compete. So over time, populations will become adapted to their local environment, to the conditions that exist through changes in individuals. So the death of some, those that are less able to compete for the resources, will die off, maybe not in that generation, but in each successive generation, they will be less likely to pass their genes on. They'll have fewer offspring, fewer reproductive chances. Those that are better able to compete will be able to pass on their genes at a higher rate, will have more offspring. So the successful reproduction of others means that those traits that made them successful, each generation will become more and more prominent in the population. So over time, the population adapts. An individual can't say, oh, I need this trait, and change their phenotype, because we can't just wish our genotype changed, right? You get what you get. So that's what natural selection acts on. That is the process of natural selection leading to adaptation of a population. So natural selection acts on the variation in a population, with those being more fit, means those are more reproductively successful. So we look at those one at a time. Organisms have heritable variation. So what Darwin really emphasized when we talked about heritable variation is that individuals within a population vary in their functional characteristics, their physical characteristics. So functional characteristic, your metabolism, how your body works; physical, how you look; physical strength, so your phenotype, your outward appearance; and behavioral characteristics. So some organisms might be more bold and aggressive, and others are a little more retreating. So there's just this wide range of variations. And what he proposed is that those variations are essential, and they allow adaptation to the environment over time. So if we think survival of the fittest, the strongest. Well, if you are a rabbit, probably being a bold rabbit who's willing to run out in front of the fox to try to get some food is not necessarily, you might be stronger than the other rabbits, but you're also exposing yourself, probably going to get killed. Whereas the rabbit who is more timid and stays hidden might survive longer. That might be the more beneficial trait that's going to get passed on. So we have adaptation, change to the environment to be better suited to the conditions in which you live at that time, and at each generation, the more successful variation will increase in the population from generation to generation. We also see organisms compete for resources. This again is looking at Malthus. If we look each generation, from generation to generation, we have the same reproductive potential. That's our R, intrinsic growth value. Without limits, how fast can we reproduce? So the reproductive potential is greater than the environment can support indefinitely. We're going to reach that carrying capacity. And so death and disease and famine, these are all inevitable if a population is going to have stability, because we just can't have indefinite growth. We've got to reach that carrying capacity and balance out. And that means individuals are going to constantly have to struggle and compete to survive, compete for resources so that they can survive and pass their genes on. Whoa, where did that go? I hit that wrong. There we go. Compete for resources. There we go. Sorry about that. Organisms have different reproductive success, individuals within a population. So when we talk about survival of the fittest, fittest is the relative reproductive success of an individual compared to others in the population. So survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean the strongest, the fastest. It means the one who survives to reproductive maturity and then is able to reproduce the most frequently. Those with the most favorable traits in the current environment are better able to compete for limited resources. So they're better able to compete. They capture a disproportionate share of resources, which they can then use for their own growth, for their own maintenance, and to have additional energy required for reproduction. Interactions with the environment determine which individual is going to reproduce the most. So naturalist selection, we talk about natural selection, survival of the fittest, occurs because some individuals have some variation in function, physical appearance, or behavior that allows them to survive and reproduce to a greater extent than others. So organisms become adapted An adaptation is an evolved trait. And when we say it's an evolved trait, it's one that occurs in increasing numbers of individuals in a population because they've inherited it. So over time. So if 1 out of 10 organisms, so if 10 and this one has it in one generation, but this one's better able to produce, then in the next generation, everybody here might have produced 2 organisms, or 2 offspring. So we now have 20, but this one produced 4. So we have 22. But 4 of them have this trait. And now those 4 produce 4. Right? So each of those 4 are going to produce 4. So we have 16 with that trait in the population out of the total population. Everybody else still is reproducing only twice. Actually, probably less because those 16 now are getting a disproportionate amount of the resources. So over time, that variation, that trait, since they're reproducing at a higher rate, their numbers will increase at a higher rate. They inherited that trait because the parent organism was better able to compete and reproduce because they had that trait. So they passed that trait on to their offspring, that genetic trait. And the environment selects what traits are most beneficial. And as it does, they become more prevalent. They increase in frequency in each succeeding generation. We're going to actually look at that in our last lab, this change in numbers over time. And as long as the environment's stable, that same variation, that same variant will be selected for and will increase in number in the population. If the environment changes, a different trait might be favored. So we'll have a change then over time. And environments tend not to be all that stable. So populations evolve, evolution, change over time. Populations evolve, not individuals. So individuals, you get the genotype that you get and the phenotype that you get, and you hope that's the one that's best suited for the current environment. But over time, the one that is best suited to the current environment will be the one that is prominent in the population. So, can we see selection at work? Well, yep. Thanks to artificial selection, humans as the selective force, not nature, not the environment, but humans, we can select for specific traits that we want over time. And look at all the variation we ended up with in these individual different traits that we've selected for. So that's an example. This is artificial selection, when we are the ones that select what trait gets to be passed on to the next generation. So humans have been using artificial selection in agriculture and animal husbandry for thousands of years. And so Darwin added that to his growing pool of evidence. And he said, if humans can create such a wide variety from artificial selection, then natural selection, the environment being the selective agent, should also produce diversity, but with the environment, not humans, being the selective force. That should be not, shouldn't it? Here's a great example of evolution happening right in front of us. When we talk about artificial selection, we mean that we are the selective force because we choose the trait that we want passed on. So in this case, even though humans are the selective force, it is not artificial, it's natural. We change the environment unnaturally, but it was not intentionally. We were not selecting for this, but it's an end result. It's antibiotic resistance. So if I have a petri dish full of bacteria, I would have lots of them. Let's say I have lots and lots of bacteria. They're similar. A few of them happen to have a mutation that makes them resistant to an antibiotic. There's no antibiotic in this plate right now, right? This is the environment. So only a few are resistant. This is a mutation that arises or arose spontaneously. So right now, it doesn't give them any benefit. If there's no antibiotic in the environment, this is not a benefit. Who cares if you're resistant? There's none here. Who cares? So every round of reproduction, let's say each one of these divides into 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I have 14 bacterium. and 2 of these, so 2 out of 14, or 1 out of 7, are resistant. In the next generation, I would have 28. And I would have 4 out of 28 that would be resistant, which reduces to 1 out of 7. And in the next generation, I would have 8 and 56, 8 out of 56, 1, 7. So I would have the same proportion that were resistant because that's not giving them any benefit. But if the environment suddenly changes and an antibiotic is introduced, that's the change to the environment, that's a selective force. The antibiotic would kill all of the bacteria that are not resistant. If the resistance was not already here, so the introduction of antibiotics doesn't cause the mutation. If the mutation wasn't here, all of those bacteria would have died, right? That variation has to be present in the population prior to the change. Now the change happens, I kill all those bacteria that weren't resistant. The only survivors are those that are. And so in the next generation, they're going to divide. Their offspring will have that mutation because it's a change in the genetics, in the genotype that's passed down. And in the next generation, they'll continue to pass down that until the entire population has that, that variation. Survival of the fittest. The one that was able to survive and reproduce did. And now that is the primary phenotype. So through heredity, through inheriting that genotype in the offspring, increase the percent of individuals in the population that have that genotype or that phenotype. So that's the population has changed over time. All right, evidence of evolution. So next section, what is the actual evidence? So we've already talked about quite a bit of it, but Darwin based his theory on fossil evidence. So fossils are a record of the history of life from the past, and they document the succession of forms, and we can see from simple to more complex. In many cases, as other organisms came about and started competing from large to small, like the sloth, the giant sloth, down to our little, 4-foot sloth now. And they document this succession of life forms. Sometimes the fossil record is very complete, shows descent from an ancestor to the present day, but we have to have certain conditions for fossilization to occur. So we have to have hard parts, we have to have instant burial, usually in an anoxic environment without oxygen for it to be preserved. So we need certain specific conditions, and so the record is incomplete. That's why we continue to dig for fossils, is to find these other ones, but there are enough examples of a complete record that we see this is a record of change over time. Biogeographical evidence. This is a distribution of plants and animals across the earth, and we see that this shows that even if we see organisms arise in one place, as they spread, they change in different habitats. We see that with the finches, see it with the tortoises, see it as we move from north to south or south to north and on elevation. So those vestigial limbs and fossils, the transitional fossils that show us, oh look, dinosaurs did have wings or have feathers. We have anatomical evidence. So our anatomical, we can look at physical structures on organisms, and we can see homologous structures. So just like homologous chromosomes, they're similar but not identical. Homologous structures are those that are anatomically similar because they come from a common ancestor. Right? So they've changed over time on different species because those different species have different niches they fill or different environments they live in. And so they have been modified to best serve the purpose needed. So they can be functionally similar, but they might not be. So the forelimb in horses and dogs, yep, kind of similar in what their function is. But in humans, nope, we don't walk on these. Or in birds, nope, we don't fly with these. So they don't have to be functionally similar, but anatomically they are. The bones, we have the same bones, but they have been modified over time. Those are homologous structures. They come from a common ancestor. They are structurally, anatomically similar, but functionally not necessarily. Analogous structures are those that have the same function, but are constructed differently. So for example, wings on birds and bats are homologous structures that do serve the same function, flight, but insect wings have the same function, but they're analogous to those other wings. They're a modification of an exoskeleton. They don't have internal bones, flesh on the outside. So their construction is different, and they don't share a common ancestor. And then vestigial structures these are fully developed anatomical structures that no longer have a function. So they have a reduced or obsolete function. For example, our last three vertebrae, the coccyx, are remnants of a tail. We no longer have a tail, but we still have the anatomical evidence that at one time some ancient ancestor did. So, example of our homologous structure, vertebrate forelimbs, we all have the same set of bones, organized in similar ways, but the length and thickness of those varies. So they've been modified extensively depending on the adaptive needs of the organism. And Darwin interpreted this as support for his hypothesis of common descent. Embryological development can look at a series of vertebrate embryos. They all have a postanal tail. They all have gill pouches, pharyngeal slits. Those have been internalized into a lung for us. They're external as gills in fish. That tail, as I said, has been reduced. So these similarities let us draw conclusions. So here it's part of your lab looking at those similar bones, but how they've been modified, all in the forelimb of these organisms. Our developmental similarities, these are those pharyngeal slits. They now become internalized. Whereas here they remain gills. Here they're external gills. So we have, at comparable stages of development, vertebrate embryos have all these common features. They look very similar. They have this postanal tail in all of them. And new or novel functions, so you say change over time, very, very tiny changes over time. Can't just poof, I have a whole new structure. So for example, the eye just didn't get poof, arise. It arose from an eye spot that was light sensitive, was photosensitive, and then it evolved with little by little by little changes over millennia. Because new or novel functions can only originate from existing structures, pre-existing structures that are just modified over time. So descent with modification. And our biochemical evidence. So now we continue to investigate evolution, to further refine that theory, to add to the theory, to find the missing pieces and describe those, but we do have enough of a model that it's pretty clear. It's 100% clear this is actually going on and we can actually observe it in the current world. There really isn't a debate about this. All living organisms use the same basic biochemical molecules. We learned all about DNA. Doesn't matter if you are a bacteria or a human or a dog or a sponge. We've got the same biochemical molecules. We use proteins, lipids, carbs, nucleic acids. We use DNA, and we have the same triplet code. We can look at that same code on table for any organism. We all use those same 20 amino acids to build all those proteins. and can look at that protein folding. That order of amino acids is going to be our primary structure and result in similar different proteins based on the order of amino acids. Our DNA base sequence differences, we can look at those now. We have the technology, the ability, anybody who watches CSI knows, to analyze, or as you learned in your lab, to analyze those base sequences. The more similar they are, the more similar two organisms are. So if two different organisms, two different species have very similar DNA-based sequences, it suggests they have a very recent common ancestor, whereas the more differences that we've had more time to accumulate differences, more mutations and changes adapted to more different environments, suggests a more ancient ancestor. And then we can look at evidence from developmental biology now that we can look at the specific gene level and compare genes. And there are some genes that show up that when they appear, so if anybody taking 102, you'll see you start with the most simple of organisms from bacteria, then we go into the protists. We're going to develop, over time we'll go to the sponges and then the jellyfish, and getting more and more complex, adding additional complexity as we go through evolutionary history. And at some point we'll see in these earlier, less complex forms, we don't have this gene, and then suddenly there's this gene. And now, every more complex group beyond that carries that same gene, just with slight modifications. So some example of these are the Hox gene. These triggered development of a segmented body plan. So until we had segmentation, we just had things like jellyfish. Right? Then we had segmentation. With us, we see that in our all vertebrates. We didn't get that until we got to annelids, so to earthworms. We start to see segmentation, and then as we progress, we see that segmentation, and all of those start, we get that more and more complex segmentation within bodies when that Hox gene arises. And then the PAX6 gene. This is another one of those developmental genes that is considered the master control for eye development. And so until we see a light spot and then increased complexity in the eye, we see variations of this PAX6 gene. But prior to that gene arising, we didn't even have the precursors to an eye. That also is responsible for a whole bunch of other sensory organ developments. So that's sort of a precursor to increasing complexity in the nervous system. All right, so those are all the evidence for evolution. Those are things that you are going to look at in your lab. I hope most of you have already finished this chapter because starting tomorrow we head into our last few days of class. We still have to cover chapters 16 and 17 and our final lab. So I will have the videos for those up a little bit later. Thank you all.